What police state? Good morning. It's Tuesday, June the 16th, and this is The Drill. Thank you very much. I'm Ron, your host and the only true conservative in the United States today. I created this podcast to answer the question most asked by conservatives, namely, what can I do? My podcast is short, approximately 5 to 10 minutes long, because shorter podcasts are easier to download and listen to. I've been listening to conservative talk radio since '89, and I grew up in a socialist household and have learned the tricks of socialism. My podcast is made available through Spreaker and can be heard on iTunes, Spotify, Google, and YouTube. Today, what can I do? Quote of the day, and the alternative to the police state? All that when I come back. Thank you. What can I do? Communicate properly. All conservatives have been unduly influenced by the left when it comes to communication. We communicate the same way that the left does. We emote. We should be communicating grammatically correct, rhetorically effective, and logically sound. And we should boldly judge to make clear universal values. Notice I didn't say our values. Let's take a look at some examples. The following are Twitter posts. From Laura Ingraham, for instance. Quote, the last thing President Trump should do is get involved in the region formerly known as Chaz. Let it play out. They'll eventually get bored and begin playing hacky sack, unquote. Actually, that was, they'll eventually get bored playing hacky sack, unquote. The shortcut to determining whether or not someone has made a value statement is to look for the use of the S word, should. Good for Ms. Ingraham here for using the S word. Her statement would be stronger if she would provide a rationale for her judgment. From President Trump, quote, the far-left fake news media, which had no COVID problem with the rioters and looters destroying Democrat-run cities, is trying to COVID shame us on our big rallies. Won't work, unquote. This is a typical left-wing oriented statement in that it is descriptive and predictive. Bad way to communicate. Which is surprising because the president is usually much better than this. And it's a bad way to communicate because it's vague and irrelevant. What the president should have said is, quote, the far-left fake news media should concentrate on providing the people with real news instead of trying to micromanage our rallies, unquote. From Liz Wheeler, quote, no, I said the movement was a farce, which you would know if you didn't selectively edit a video from 4 years to make it seem like I said something I didn't, unquote. Ms. Wheeler was successfully baited by the left here with an arbitrary claim using a racism trigger. Ms. Wheeler should have ignored the arbitrary claim because responding to an arbitrary claim is to validate it. I know it's hard when somebody's implying that you're something you're not, but she should trust her viewers, readers, audience to know who she is and what she's about. Communication is important because it reflects the way you think, and the way you think will influence the way that you vote. Next up, quote of the day. Thank you. The quote of the day comes from Don Schwager. Father in heaven, you have given me a mind to know you, a will to serve you, and a heart to love you. Give me today the grace and strength to embrace your holy will and fill my heart with your love, that all my intentions and actions may be pleasing to you. Give me the grace to be charitable in thought, kind in deed, and loving in speech towards all. Up next, an alternative to the police state. Thank you. Now, from the American Institute for Economic Research, an article entitled American History Reveals the Alternative to the Police State. Americans could reform their police departments in many ways to make them less brutal, but some protesters go further and seek to dismantle them entirely. Cynics might see such a move as a ploy to spend taxes on local income redistribution programs while drawing policing resources from state and federal police agencies. After all, nobody's going to finance businesses that cannot obtain adequate insurance coverage due to a dearth of local law and order infrastructure. Eliminating the police entirely certainly would stop police brutality, but many people fear that even more violent alternatives would arise to fill the resulting void. They imagine violent anarchy, mob rule, or rule by the mob, i.e., organized crime syndicates like the mafia or Mexican drug cartels. Something like that could result, but with a proper transition, we could also end up with a more peaceful, prosperous society without a police presence. I speak not of some utopian scheme, but of history, American history. America's first police force in the modern sense formed in Boston in 1838, over half a century after the Declaration of Independence. But it wasn't until the 1880s, a century after independence from British tyranny, that all major U.S. cities operated police departments. Businesses eager to lay the cost of protecting their property onto all taxpayers, not public disdain for criminal activity, were the prime movers of the change. Why wasn't policeless early America overrun with crime and anarchy? Most commentators cop out, pun intended, with some variation of, quote, those were the simpler times, unquote, non-explanation. For starters, those were more complex times. If you don't believe me, try living a week without running water, electricity, gas heat, or toilet paper. Lack of just the last mentioned item alone sent half the country into a tizzy just a few months ago. It isn't that things were just safer then either, as people living on the frontier might have had the tops of their skulls removed while watching their wives get raped and their children's brains get bashed out on trees. Nay, people's lives were less valuable then, and horrific acts of violence that would make the George Floyd video look downright peaceful by comparison occurred. Interracial violence between American Indians and Euro-American colonists and enslavers and enslaved was particularly brutal, but mutually beneficial commerce was the rule in the former case, and in the latter, violence on both sides was considered the natural result of the state of war existing between them. No violence then, interracial or otherwise, entailed a breach of trust the way police brutality does today. So how did early Americans prosper without the putative protection of a police state? For starters, many armed themselves, as was their right under the original understanding of the Second Amendment, various state constitutional clauses, and natural rights doctrine. Each adult understood that they had to protect themselves, their loved ones, and their own property. Not everyone armed themselves with a gun or a blade, especially in American settings, where crowds provided adequate personal defense in daylight in most neighborhoods. Older gentlemen with something to lose, however, might often carry ingenious contraptions like cane swords and guns just in case. In rural areas, you were lacking if you weren't packing because you never knew when a desperate predator of the human or furry variety might try to steal your stuff or take your life. For those too young to remember, Michael Bellaciel's claim that the early Americans didn't own many functioning firearms was the original fake news. Turns out that most early Americans were armed to protect themselves and others when called to do so via militia or posse duty, forms in-kind taxation that turned every able-bodied man into a temporary riot suppressor or law enforcement official when needed. Early Americans were not very effective at either role. You get what you pay for, which was nothing, but that was the point. Early Americans were not eager to again see regular troops in the streets or living in their houses, and hence remained satisfied with numerous government-run militia units of indifferent quality, augmented by a few elite privately organized and run units, usually of cavalry or cannon. Occasional units established by rival political factions squared off against each other, as they did on Albany on Independence Day in 1788. But the cannon play was half-hearted, as nobody had an incentive to destroy their own city. Laws were easily enforced because there were relatively few of them, and they were widely viewed as legitimate. so no thief, rapist, or murderer could escape justice other than fleeing to the frontier or some seafaring vessel. People prayed for those who fell victim to alcohol or other intoxicants and sought to help them via nonprofit organizations. Where early America lost its way was not by not allowing insurance companies to develop programs to limit theft and property damage. The gist is that until the mid-20th century, regulators forced U.S. insurers to provide one and only one type of insurance. As a result, theft insurance received short shrift as more insurers concentrated on insuring goods in transit along with ships, wagons, and railroad cars in which goods were shipped or fire insurance. In both instances, insurers led the way in safety improvements, especially the development of fire-resistant buildings and manufacturing protocols. At the same time, as noted above, businesses that could not find theft insurance turned to police departments instead. What does all this mean for Minneapolis and other cities considering eliminating their police forces? In short, it can be done safely if, number one, governments restore individual Second Amendment rights to all citizens, which should have been done after SCOTUS made clear in various decisions that the police did not have to protect individuals or their property. That's right, liberals, your very own New York Times wrote about it in 2005. For those readers who rightly do not trust that source, here's a more recent overview from Mises.org. A wave of mass shootings will not ensue, and in fact gun violence probably remain the same except in domestic disputes, admits the New York Times. South Dakota, which long had liberal gun laws, last year enacted constitutional carry, which means that anybody can carry anywhere, any weapon, anywhere in public, open or concealed without a permit. The main opposition to the bill came from law enforcement, which rightly viewed it as a threat to their funding as free people learned the police are unnecessary. Private citizens used their gun rights to protect themselves and their property when out-of-state riders tried to cause problems in Sioux Falls on May 31st. Number two, governments repeal laws against victimless crimes like drug use and prostitution. Repealing such laws would render large percentages of police force and most of its contact with the public unnecessary. Number three, governments allow insurers to enforce traffic laws. Another major drain on police department resources. Insurers can do so by insisting on higher premiums for moving infractions, like speeding, which can be enforced via on-board motoring devices, as well as intersection cams owned and operated by a consortium of automobile insurers. Number four, governments concede that most private property protection in America is already provided by private security companies working in conjunction with insurers. Regulatory barriers to the further development of private security and insurance should be removed to ensure that businesses and homeowners are sufficiently protected from theft and other physical risks to be able to obtain financing. Basically, insurance works through market forces. Insurers tell insured businesses and homeowners that their premium will go down if they take certain precautions. Insurers can, or the insureds can shop around for better terms if they wish. Property insurance is a very competitive industry, so insurance is usually available at the lowest, actually warily rational rates. When not overregulated, insurers have incentives to provide quasi-public, often shared club goods like research, safety testing, search and rescue ships, and even roadside assistance, usually through cooperative endeavors. They have and could again provide private firefighting services that put out all fires and work out payments later behind the scenes. Protection services could be provided in a like manner, with perpetrators apprehended and turned directly over to the criminal justice system while insurers worked out the costs among themselves. To the knee-jerk haters of capitalism out there, the specter of private protection forces and large insurers may seem dystopian, but consider that consumers defund poorly performing companies every day without having to stage mass protests or win drawn-out political battles. They simply shift their dollars from bad apple to good job. Insurers would have strong incentives, in other words, to prevent security guards from unionizing, and of course, partial immunity would not protect their bad acts. They would also have strong incentives not to hire guards or former police officers with bad reputations. The key would be to keep the property insurance and private insurance security sectors competitive, as there's little reason to replace a state monopoly with a private one. If I'd proposed these changes a few months ago, critics would have labeled such experiments as too dangerous to attempt. But since mid-March, our governments have conducted much more dangerous experiments in central planning that utterly and predictably failed. There's ample evidence that the decriminalization of Americans' personal lives, the proliferation of gun ownership, and the encouragement of competitive markets for property insurance and private protection services can greatly improve upon our current monopolistic, union-controlled, taxpayer-funded machines of state repression. And this is an article that was written by Robert E. Wright. Back in a minute. Who is a true conservative? He's the person that has the courage of his convictions and is confident in what he knows. He's the person that understands that cultural conservatism is more important than political conservatism. He's not selfish, but minds his own business. He acts like an adult. He is patriotic and uses common sense. He expresses what he knows and does so with certainty. He makes judgments, refuses to speculate, speaks clearly and definitively, and is not afraid to say no. He's open-minded, asking why rather than why not. He's consistent, credible, and influential, not ashamed of his existence, unafraid to learn or correct his mistakes. He's a normal American, and he is better than the socialist. If you don't know, you got to know that. If you don't know with every fiber of your being that being a true conservative is best, then you're simply wasting your time. And that brings me to the end of another episode of The Drill. Remember, be honest, be smart, and be beautiful, and always ask yourself, what is real? How do I know? What do I do about it? I'm Ron. That's The Drill.